Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we'd talk a little bit about Israel today. Things have been going quite well for them, right, Jim?
Yes, despite predictions otherwise, the Abraham Accords, which Austin will get into, have held up. And Israel has basically become an unofficial part of NATO. They're selling a lot more weapons to NATO countries without any grief. They're also conducting more international training. They have their blue flag exercises, which are angering certain, countries like Iran, because more and more of the Arab countries are joining. And of course, there's another thing they've got going in Greece, where they've partnered with Greece to start a pilot training operation, competing with one that just started up in Italy. Also, with some help from the Israelis, and the Arabs are hard pressed. The Iranians are hard pressed to slow this down. They are trying. They basically ordered their militias in Lebanon and Yemen to pile on, not to surrender, because that's all they've got. Now they're doing fairly well with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is basically threatening to restart the civil war, which ended in 1990 after 15 years. Unfortunately, the end of Hezbollah, the end of that civil war, basically led to the how should I put it, the permanence of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was the only militia in the peace agreement that was allowed to keep its weapons, because they were technically fighting to drive the Israelis out of southern Lebanon. Of course, the people of southern Lebanon didn't want the Israelis leaving, but eventually they did, rather than have another war with Lebanon in Lebanon. And of course, that's coming back to haunt them. But the Israeli Prime Minister recently visited, last couple of weeks, Russia, where he and Vladimir Putin came to an unofficial understanding, or treaty, whatever you want to call it, that they would do all they could to get the Iranians out of Syria. Now, that's critical for the Iranians, because if they're turfed out of Syria by one way or another, that will much reduce their leverage in Lebanon. And of course, the majority of Lebanese, who have lots of problems right now, well, they always had lots of problems, but after the 1990 peace deal, they became much more corrupt. And that has led to, for example, a 90% decline in the currency, which is more, how should I put it, created by a few politicians who are getting rich over it, whereas most people are losing, 90% of whatever money they had in the bank. They're blocking the government is blocking, because of the sectarianism, an investigation of that ammonium nitrate explosion earlier in the year, which basically destroyed much of the port of Beirut. And, Lebanon really wants a change, and they're not going to get it as long as the Iranians are sitting in Syria and able to keep their Hezbollah going. Now, another factor which may come into play, the Iranians are making a full court press to get the sanctions lifted, the sanctions that were reimposed in 2017, and caused them great grief, especially in Lebanon, where they had to cut in half their economic subsidies to Hezbollah, which caused a lot of Hezbollah employees, and there are many of them, to lose their jobs or suffer big pay cuts. So, it's one thing after another. Iran keeps saying, hang with us, we'll make it all better, but, their track record so far is sinking more and more, and we can't afford to let them make a comeback. So, Israel is basically standing in the way of all sorts of bad stuff, and a lot more people are coming to realize that.
Austin, How are the Abraham's Accords going?
Dan, they appear to be on hold, but they're not. They appear to be on hold because, in part, the current U.S. Administration seeks to de-emphasize them. And if that seems a little bit harsh, or at least ignore them, because the prior administration brought what were perceived as enemies together at the table, meaning Arab Muslim states and Israel. They really aren't. Jim brought up the blue flag exercises. UAE had observers at it. There's some indication that, of course, they were, say, observers, but they're also discussing how they would operate with Israeli forces in a war. And of course, who would be the likely enemy there? It's Iran. Jim already brought that up. In the blue flag, the British and U.S. forces were definitely participating. By the way, now Israel is in Central Command. For a long time, it was curious to what command it was in, whether it was in EUCOM, European Command, or CENTCOM. That may sound like a small deal or a large deal, but it's makes them clearly that it's Central Command, which would be involved in a war with Iran. The thing about the Abraham Accords is that there were a lot of Arabs and Israelis who, for decades, really at least 3 decades, more, but definitely 3 decades. We got to end in this. There's too much upside, and there's so much upside to even cold peace, much less warm peace. The examples on that were already Jordan and Egypt, and because Jordan and Israel have been in business, really. The sad thing was the '67 war, which was a mistake on King Hussein's part to launch it, but they've been in business and doing well for each other. And then after Sadat and Begin, with their agreement that the Carter administration helped foster, the cold peace was productive for both Israel and Egypt, if only from the point that they're not. Well, and I'll say this from Egypt's point of view: we're not wasting money fighting people who are going to defeat us, and will be a big waste of money as well as a waste of lives. Now, that may seem cynical, but the deal is that it's also a realistic assessment. That assessment was made also by Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, what do you want to call it? That water dam that's between Qatar and UAE and Iran, Persian Gulf states, Gulf Cooperation Council states. At the major international trade level, the Emiratis, the UAE, were already also doing business with the Israelis because they're just so much technology, so much finance knowledge, and it paid off for both of them. Everybody, even the Al Qaeda and Islamic State radicals knew that this was going on, and the Saudis had got caught, if you remember, a few years ago in one of I think it was a WikiLeaks scandal. There was a senior Saudi defense minister who was having a conversation with someone I believe was in the U.S. State Department. I haven't looked at this in years, but I remember reading it in some of the published material. And I'm paraphrasing him, but basically he said, if the Israelis want an air corridor to come through to strike the Iranians, they'll get one. And that got some play. I think we even had a couple of comments on Strategy Page about that. We can do a search and turn it up. but you'd see that, and that's really 15, 20 years old. That kind of cooperation in extremists and defense cooperation was going on the QT, the quiet. It was, but it was there. So you've got the public social interest. You've got the economic interest, and you've got the military defense interest that are all lined up with. I know the Saudis aren't there yet, but the Emiratis are. The Kuwaitis want to be. The Qataris walk a little line, but they're interested. Bahrain. You have Sudan, who's also come in on it. It's going to be interesting to see how that comes out after this coup by the military. But my thought on it is that it's not going to change a relationship it's got with the Israelis. You already had the Egyptians and the Jordanians, and it's not only in public and in day-to-day diplomacy, and it's overt now. You're seeing, as Jim said and pointed out, to the blue flag exercises, but you're seeing overt defense military cooperation. And it's also, I think this is something that two other regional powers, Russia and Turkey. I think the Russians are aware of it. The Russians are aware that they can make money with the Israelis, and even though they're going to play their radical cards, they have I'm not quite sure what the word would be, but they're not going to get in the way of this rapprochement. They haven't. And here the Turks had really an alliance with the Israelis up until the time of Erdogan, or Sultan Recep, as he's called, and we call him that on the strategy page as well, where he goes around with this political Islamist card. Bad Israelis, and really ruptures the technological and defense alliance and economic alliance that the Israelis had and the Turks had. I think he's left on the outside of this because the Turks have tried to maintain good relations with the wealthy Arab petrostates, and you see the major ones, if not signing on to the Abraham Accords, they are nodding at it, or in nodding agreement. I think the Turks are also angered, but it's Erdogan's doing. I'm not going to blame the day-to-day Turks. It's Erdogan's part of his egotism, egotistical neo-Ottoman Empire activity. It's Jim brought up the Greeks and the Israelis. They've got defense. They've got defense arrangements. They're increasingly strong, but they've also got economic arrangements because of the way that they're using their seabeds for that. For the oil and gas deposits, primarily the large natural gas deposits off the Israeli coast. The Leviathan field, I think, is the major one. That's great too. That's the Book of Jonah there, Dan. The Leviathan out there. The Israelis are going to run gas transmission lines up off of Cyprus, which aggravates the Turks, and goes on to Greece. So it's not that Greece is part of the Abraham Accords, but they are part of NATO. So is Turkey. But as Jim pointed out, you've got all these major NATO nations that now exercise openly with the Israelis and do so in Israel, with the blessing of the Arab states that have signed the Abraham Accords. So it's like it is a diplomatic and public expression of a lot of things that have been going on for 30 years, which tells me that's it's reached the point that not only can we talk about it and recognize it, it's becoming a day-to-day economic and political reality. So that's the significance of it. It's not going to die because it works for so many people that really want it to work. I just wish that the United States would be back publicly back on the diplomatic side of it, as Jim pointed out, the military's engaged in it, and that's a form of open source diplomacy. But the actually getting those agreements out was significant. It was a Nobel Peace Prize worthy accomplishment, I think, Dan.
Jim, Iran and Israel have had some, I guess the best term for it would be some cyber competition with each other. Is that still going on?
Yes. For one thing, there are two reasons for doing it. One is the military diplomatic information to steal. The second is economic theft. Israel is one of the how should I put it, the leaders in developing new technology of all sorts, from medical to military, through you name it. The Israelis are doing it. It's how they survive as a small nation in a volatile area. And the Emiratis are especially interested in basically working with Israel because they're moving in the same direction. The Emiratis actually have, according to the Transparency International, for the last couple of years, they've had a higher clean government score than Israel. Israel has its internal problems, which we reported on regularly with the Hasidim, their Arab minority. Although the Arab minority is turning around now and realizing that, well, hey, if the Emiratis, can basically, deal with reality, so can we. But again, there's still a large minority of the Israeli, 20% of the population, citizens, who are Arabs. Who are basically, interested in destroying the paradise, so to speak, the relative paradise they're living in. But that brings up another problem. One reason the Saudis have a problem in basically going public with allying with Israel is that for over 50 years, they have been condemning Israel as, foreigners, as, enemies of Islam, as basically oppressing the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in a practical sense, the Saudis have backed off on all of that. The problem is, how do they deal with the indoctrination of their own people? The Saudis always had a problem with Islamic fundamentalism. The Wahhabi strain, so to speak, of Islam is one of the more, how should I put it, fundamentalists. And the Saudis use that to the Saud family to gain control over what most of Arabia, except for the Emirati states, the coastal states, and Yemen, by basically keeping everybody happy. It didn't really work out. In the late 70s, they had a bunch of local maniacs invading the Kaaba, the holiest shrine in Mecca, and that was very difficult to get them out. And part of getting them out was making a compromise with the clergy, as it were, the very conservative clergy, that they would basically hand over the educational system to the conservatives. Now, it was still possible for a ambitious Saudi to get an education, a useful education, as it were, in STEM, in science and technology. Most of them ended up living in the West, because even if they got such an education, there weren't that many jobs, unless it was, in the petroleum industry, and a lot of those jobs are now held by Saudis. But the basically several generations of Saudis have got a disproportionate number of bright young men and women who have degrees in religious studies. which anywhere in the world will not get you, will not provide you with the skills to get a decent job. The Saudis further, they basically handicap themselves by spending the money by basically creating this huge welfare state where most of the hard work was done by immigrants, either poor immigrants from South Asian, Bangladesh, and what have you, as laborers doing the labor, and more educated immigrants from Palestine, which didn't last long, and because when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, it was that they were basically urged to move on to Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinians, it turned out, were cheering on the Iraqis. They never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. So they were pitched out of Saudi Arabia by and large, and many other countries where they had good jobs. And of course, now the Palestinians are trying to be an obstacle to any peace, including the Abraham Accords, by not accepting a two-state solution. Now, technically, the UN says yes, they do, and we still back it. But there's a constant stream of Palestinian media basically saying peace with Israel is not possible. The only solution is the destruction of Israel. They publish more and more. Well, they only publish maps showing the Israel not there and just Palestine. And this is a problem which most Arab states have recognized, but they have a hard time selling it to their citizens. Well, in Saudi Arabia in particular. But in Saudi Arabia, again, they have to square any deal they make with their conservative brand of Islam. I mean, it's so conservative, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of this. No other religion can openly worship in Saudi Arabia. No Christian churches, no Hindu, no nothing. They made exceptions for Aramco employees who are overwhelmingly from the West, where they could worship at home. But if anything in public would get you arrested. The same thing with alcohol, which they sort of eased up a little bit, but things you couldn't do in public, and you had to be careful doing in private. And this is changing slowly. The Crown Prince, who's the de facto head of the Saudi Arabia MSB, the king is basically senile and just waiting out his time. But the Crown Prince is firmly ensconced, as the successor. He wants to make a lot more changes, and he's finding out that too many Saudis just aren't ready yet, and that's a problem they've acknowledged for decades now, and they've been working on it, but it's tough. I mean, getting several people who are several generations away from the dirt poor economic situation of most Saudis. Up to World War II, actually up to the 60s, that's radically changed. Most of them don't really have to work. They get a cushy government job, which requires no effort, on their part. And the Saudis are trying to wean them away from that because they haven't got the money anymore. There are a lot more Saudis taking advantage of it. And the oil price went down. It's back up now, but there's no telling, when it's going to go down again, because the rest of the world is learning how to do with less oil and how to produce cheaper oil or more oil themselves, cutting out the Middle Eastern sources. So we have problems here which are self-inflicted, which even if you want to change them, they can't be done with the snap of a finger, as it were. As Austin pointed out, there have been unofficial, cooperation, government to government, between almost all of the states in Arabia, with the possibly likely exception of Yemen. That's a whole other story. The Qataris, as Austin pointed out, have been basically trying to walk the line between Iran and the rest of Arabia, somewhat successfully, but they have a lot of money, and they've been very clever at how they go about it. But the writing is on the wall, as it were, that the future is alliance with Israel, and not with the basically the enemies of Israel, like Iran. Iran was long seen as a threat to the Arabs. I'll never forget back in the 70s, before the Shah was overthrown, there was this article in I think it was New York Magazine, had a picture on the cover with the Imperial Marines storming ashore in Saudi Arabia. Because even then, the Arabs realized that the Iranians believed a lot of the Arab oil belonged to Iran, and were scheming to take it back. Now, how real that was, I don't know. I mean, the Shah did a lot of things wrong, but I don't think he was seriously planning on going to war with the Arab states. But they saw Iran as a threat, and after the 80s, when the religious dictatorship took over in Iran, a Shia dictatorship, bit by bit, the Iranian, theoretic state began including the Arab states in their list of enemies. And in the last 10 years, they've been saying, we really should be running Mecca, the holy, most holy, pilgrimage sites in Islam, not the Saudis, because the Saudis are not really good Muslims. So for the Saudis, the battle with Iran, no matter who's running it, is life or death. There's no wiggle room anymore. But again, all this 50, 60 years of anti-Israel propaganda is a tough thing to wear down. It's easy to get to the people running the governments who, after a while, have to face reality, even while many of their citizens do not want to. But to make big changes, official changes, you have to basically come out and say, all right, we made mistakes were made, we have to correct them. Iran is doing their work for them. But the problem with Iran is they see a good chance, even though they have a hardcore government now. I mean, we got to remember, Iran has elections, but they're controlled elections. Anybody running for office in Iran, especially for the parliament, which basically selects the prime minister, the senior people in the cabinet, has to be approved or can be vetoed by the Guardians Council. This is the council of 12 senior clerics who basically are the ultimate power in Iran. And in this last election, nobody who was anywhere close to being against the hardline, Israel must be destroyed, et cetera, line was allowed to get anywhere near, a candidacy. And so now you have basically the prime minister was accused of being a war criminal as far back as the 1980s. And of course, several of his ministers are on the international terrorist blacklist. And the Iranians basically, you can see they're upping the ante more and more because they do not want to surrender. The Iranians don't want a civil war. They didn't have one to overthrow the Shah. They just had to overthrow what they considered a corrupt government, which didn't have much public support. But we're basically edging towards another blow up, a major blow up as far as Iran is concerned, because a lot of Iranians are basically quietly abandoning Islam. They can't do this publicly because that's a capital offense you can be executed for. But the government, like any dictatorship, they have their own informant network, and they conduct unofficial but fairly accurate polls of public opinion. Even Russia did this, and the results have been coming back about this. Let's get rid of Islam. Islam is all of our problems, et cetera, and let's get rid of the current government. So Iran is going for broke. Now, going for broke, if they have nuclear weapons, could get very ugly very quickly. And that's why the Iranians are willing to basically make any promises that they have to, that they won't keep, in order to get the sanctions lifted so they can get their nuclear weapons program in high gear. They're already breaking the agreements they were keeping to get some trade with Russia and China. But they can't openly buy a lot of stuff they need because they simply haven't got the money. So cash has always been the key, to Iranian success in becoming a successful and longer-lasting dictatorship. But the Iranians have a unique, well, not a unique. They've always been basically famous for their ability to talk their way out of all sorts of problems that other countries don't. That's why they were the regional superpower for centuries. Them and the Turks. They don't like the Turks because the Turks were basically one group they couldn't defeat. They couldn't stop. They lost what is now majority of Iraq to the Turks. Like 300 years ago, and they've never gotten over that. They also lost the Azerbaijanis, or at least I think the majority of them, to Russia in the 19th century. The Russians tried to take all of Azerbaijan after World War II, and we stepped in and stopped them. That won the how should I put it, the gratitude of the monarchy. But it was basically a mark against us for the Islamic government that followed in the 1980s. So yeah, things are looking good for this progress. This how should I put it? Abraham Accord. Peaceful trade, no war threats and what have you. But right now, the main impediment is Iran. And the Iranians have always put the fear of their capabilities into the Arabs. Even when they got all the oil, the Arabs thought we finally have a way to basically reduce our fear of Iran. But it's still there because the Iranians are basically redoubling their efforts. Nothing encourages the Iranians to basically come up with new ways to stay alive than the threat. And they've been threatened more than ever before in the last decade. The question is, is the immovable object or the irresistible force going to win in this contest? And that's still open to question.
Austin, do you have anything to say before we wrap this up?
No, but one of the key things Jim said, reinforcing that. One of the key elements that led to the Abraham Accords was the Iranian threat to get nuclear weapons, fear by the Gulf Arab states, fear of being abandoned by whom? The United States, Europe, sold out when the Israelis wouldn't sell them out because they're there. That's important to recognize that, as Jim said, Iran is its own worst enemy in solidifying, creating the context for the Abraham Accords, but then in solidifying public recognition, and it's still the driver that's going on within Saudi Arabia. Jim's description of what we'll call the long-term effects of vicious ethnic and religious propaganda on the Saudi people. Yes, that's there, and that's makes it extremely difficult. Suddenly, we've been lying to you for 50, 60, 70 years, or exaggerating, and the worst type of exaggerations, and that is an impediment. But at the same time, there are individuals who've been doing business and doing so openly, maybe not in Saudi Arabia and in Israel, but fine, they're doing it in Athens or London. Really, they were doing it in Dubai and in the UAE as well. But the UAE was really an open place for those kind of negotiations, those kind of deals, and as a transshipment point. So the other thing I would add, Dan, and not to go off on another tangent, is Israeli technology has really valuable. It's what one of the things the Turkish military wants to be able to tap. That's because there's common interests, again, not with Iran, but also with chaos in Central Asia, and in our case too, we've done so many semi-covert co-development projects, particularly in air and missile defense with the Israelis. Iron Dome is a physical manifestation of that. A fabulous system for defending towns and neighborhoods from tactical missile and artillery strikes. Very attractive to have the Israelis as allies. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, we'll continue to watch the situation there in Israel and the rest of the Middle East, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Take care.